Picture this. You've worked for 15 years. 15 years of early mornings, skipped vacations, and packed lunches eaten at a desk while everyone else went out. You saved every single dollar you could, you sacrificed, you planned, and then, finally, you bought your dream home. A place with a little yard, a 2-car garage, a neighborhood that looked like it came right out of a home improvement magazine. Quiet streets, trimmed hedges, kids riding bikes at dusk. It was perfect. And then, one Tuesday morning, you walk out to get your mail, and you find a yellow envelope sitting on your doorstep. Not a letter from a friend, not a birthday card, not even a bill. No, it's a fine notice for $250. Because, according to someone you have never met and never voted for, your mailbox post is the wrong shade of brown. Not the wrong mailbox. Not a broken fence. Not an abandoned car on your lawn. The wrong shade of brown. And that, my friends, is just the beginning of one of the most incredible David versus Goliath stories you're going to hear this year. Because what this one resident did when the HOA, the Homeowners Association, decided to make his life a living nightmare. It is the kind of story that makes you want to stand up and cheer. Stay with me. This is going to get wild. Let's go back to the summer of 2019. The place is Meadowbrook Estates, a planned residential community located about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. Now, Meadowbrook Estates sounds lovely, doesn't it? And it was, at least, it looked that way from the outside. The neighborhood had about 340 homes, all built between 2004 and 2011 by a developer named Ridgeline Properties. They were the kind of cookie-cutter suburban homes that all sort of looked the same: beige, tan, or cream exteriors, 2-car garages, manicured lawns separated by little strips of mulch flower bed. The streets had names like Willow Creek Drive, Sunridge Lane, and Coventry Court. It had that whole everything is fine here energy. And when a man named Marcus Webb moved in, a 43-year-old high school history teacher and part-time basketball coach, he felt like he had finally made it. Marcus was not what you'd call a troublemaker. In fact, if you asked anyone who knew him, they'd describe him with words like patient, fair, calm. He coached 15-year-olds for a living. He had the temperament of a monk. He fixed things when they broke. He kept his lawn mowed. He waved at his neighbors from the driveway. He was the guy who remembered everyone's name in the neighborhood and would shovel your driveway before you even woke up after a snowstorm. Marcus had bought his home, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house at 14 Coventry Court, for $287,000. He got a decent mortgage rate, and he was proud of every single square foot of that place. He'd repainted the interior himself over a long weekend. He'd planted tomatoes along the back fence. He even built a small raised garden bed in the side yard, which his daughter Emma, 9 years old and obsessed with strawberries, called her garden. He'd read the HOA documents before he signed. Of course he had. He was a history teacher. He read things. The rules seemed reasonable. Don't leave your trash cans out past 24 hours after pickup. Keep your lawn under a certain height. Don't build structures over a certain size without approval. Reasonable. Civil. Standard. What he did not realize, what almost nobody realizes, is that there's a massive gap between what an HOA looks like on paper and what an HOA actually is when a few specific people are in charge of it. And the people in charge of Meadowbrook Estates HOA? Let me introduce you to them. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA board in the summer of 2019 consisted of 5 members. But the power, the real, uncontested, iron-fisted power, belonged to one woman. Her name was Diane Kowalski. Now, I want to be fair here. I'm sure Diane had many qualities. Maybe she baked a lovely casserole. Maybe she was a wonderful aunt. I genuinely don't know. But as the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, Diane Kowalski operated less like a community volunteer and more like a tiny-scale authoritarian with a clipboard and too much free time. Diane had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since 2006. She'd been on the HOA board since 2012 and had served as president since 2015, 4 straight terms, which, by the way, the HOA bylaws only technically allowed for 3, but apparently no one had looked that closely. She drove a white Cadillac, wore her reading glasses on a pearl chain around her neck, and had an assistant. Let's be clear here, not a paid employee, just a retired neighbor named Gerald who seemed to worship the ground she walked on. who kept notes during every HOA meeting and typed them up in a font Diane had personally selected, Times New Roman 11 point with half-inch margins. Diane's favorite phrase, according to multiple residents we'll hear from, was, "The CC and RS are very clear on this." CC and RS, for those unfamiliar, stand for covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the big document that governs what you can and can't do with your property in an HOA community. And Diane quoted that document the way a lawyer quotes case law, selectively, strategically, and always to win. The rest of the board was made up of her two friends, Linda and Tom, who voted with her on everything. A quiet man named Rob who seemed perpetually uncomfortable and once tried to abstain from a vote only to be told by Diane that abstaining is not an option, Robert, and a newer member named Priya, who had joined the board with good intentions and had, by most accounts, spent the better part of a year slowly realizing what she had gotten herself into. Now here's the part that makes this story more than just a neighborhood dispute. Because this wasn't just about rules. This was about money. Here's what most homeowners don't realize when they sign on the dotted line to join an HOA community. The association collects dues. In Meadowbrook Estates, that was $175 per month per household. Multiply that by 340 homes, and you've got roughly $714,000 per year flowing through the HOA's accounts. Now, most of that money is supposed to go toward legitimate community expenses. Landscaping the common areas, maintaining the pool and the small gym in the community center, street lighting, insurance, repairs, all reasonable things. But here's the question that nobody in Meadowbrook Estates had ever asked because nobody had ever felt comfortable enough to ask it. Where exactly was the money going? Were the books balanced? Were the bids for maintenance contracts competitive? Was the reserve fund, the savings account the HOA was supposed to maintain for major future repairs, actually funded? Marcus had been living in Meadowbrook Estates for about 8 months when the mailbox fine showed up. He paid it, reluctantly. He called the management company the HOA had hired, a firm called Summit Ridge Management, and he asked about the fine politely. He was told, and I quote, "The color coding for mailbox posts was updated in the 2018 amendment to the CC and RS. You can find it in Appendix D." He looked up Appendix D. He found it. He stared at the color swatch printed on the page. He compared it to his mailbox post. And here is the kicker. They looked exactly the same. Both of them were described as colonial brown. They were, to any human eye, the same color. He called back. He was told, the specific colonial brown in Appendix D is Sherwin-Williams SW2838. Your post appears to be painted with a competitor product. Marcus blinked. He literally blinked several times in a row, processing this information. He then said, very calmly, "You are telling me that my mailbox post is the wrong brand of brown?" The woman on the phone said, "The CC and RS are very clear on this." There it was, the phrase, the beginning of everything. Marcus paid the fine. He repainted the post. He ordered the exact correct Sherwin-Williams paint from a local hardware store, climbed out there on a Saturday morning with a 2-inch brush, and he painted that post while muttering to himself about bureaucracy. His neighbor across the street, a retired electrician named Don, watched from his porch and called out, "New to the neighborhood." Huh? Marcus said, "Getting there." Don laughed. "They'll find something else. They always do." Don was right. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a notice about his gutters. Apparently, the gutters on the east side of his house had leaves in them, visible from the street, and this constituted a violation of the community's exterior maintenance standards. The fine? $150. Marcus cleaned the gutters. He did not complain. He was still in give them the benefit of the doubt mode. He assumed maybe these were real concerns. Maybe the neighborhood had had problems with residents letting things slide. Maybe the fines were just meant to keep standards high. He wanted to be a good neighbor. He was a team player. But then, and here's where things start getting interesting, he noticed something. While he was up on the ladder, cleaning his gutters, he looked down the street and he noticed that Don's gutters, just visible from the road, also appear to have leaves in them. And Don had not received a fine. He asked Don about it casually. Don shrugged and said, "I've been here 13 years. They don't bother me much." Marcus filed that observation away. He didn't know what to do with it yet, but it stuck. The next fine came 6 weeks later. This one was for the raised garden bed that his daughter Emma had planted her strawberries in. The notice stated that unapproved structures in non-rear yard areas were prohibited. The side yard, according to the notice, was considered a visible zone and required architectural review committee approval for any addition. The fine was $200. The garden bed was made of 6 cedar boards, screwed together, filled with topsoil. It was maybe 18 inches high and 4 feet long. Emma had painted her name on the side in purple paint. Marcus stared at the notice for a long time. He thought about his 9-year-old daughter and her strawberries. He thought about the look on her face when she'd carried those little starter plants home from the nursery in her lap. He thought about how she'd watered them every evening and checked them every morning and talked to them, because apparently that's a thing kids do. And then he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly to himself, standing in the kitchen, "Okay, now I'm paying attention." Marcus Webb was a history teacher. And here's the thing about history teachers. They know what happens when one side has all the information and the other side doesn't. They've read the stories. They know how those stories end. So Marcus started doing his homework. He went online and he found the full 78-page CC and RS document from Meadowbrook Estates. He also found the HOA bylaws, a separate 31-page document. He printed both of them out, and he sat at his kitchen table on a Friday night with a highlighter, a pen, and a legal pad, and he read every single word. What he found was fascinating, not because of what the document said, but because of the gap between what the document said and how the HOA was actually operating. First, he noticed that the CC and RS specifically required any fine over $100 to be preceded by a written warning with a minimum 30-day cure period. Marcus had never received a warning about his gutters. He had gone straight to a fine. That was, by the HOA's own governing documents, illegal. Second, he found that the architectural review process, the process you supposedly needed to go through to get approval for things like garden beds, required a decision within 45 days of a completed application. If no decision was issued within 45 days, the application was deemed approved by default. This was actually in the document, in black and white, on page 34. Marcus sat back in his chair. He reread that sentence 3 times. Deemed approved by default. He made a little note on his legal pad. He put a star next to it. Third, and this one really got his attention. The bylaw stated that the HOA board was required to hold an annual meeting open to all residents, that they were required to provide 30 days written notice before that meeting, and that financial statements were to be presented at that meeting and made available to any homeowner upon written request. Marcus had lived in Meadowbrook for 8 months. He had received no notice of any annual meeting. He had seen no financial statements. He made another star on his legal pad. He then went online and searched for Meadowbrook Estates HOA on the Ohio State Business Registry. Because here's something most people don't know. HOAs are legal entities. They're registered. They file documents. He found the registration for Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Incorporated. He found their registered agent. He found that their last filed annual report with the state of Ohio was from 2017. It was now 2019. He made a third star on his legal pad and drew a circle around all 3 of them. Marcus didn't keep this discovery to himself. He was smart enough to know that one man complaining about an HOA looks like a crank. He needed allies. He started having casual conversations with neighbors. Not formal meetings, just over-the-fence talks, sidewalk chats, the kind of thing that looks completely normal in a neighborhood. And what he heard surprised him. Almost every single person he talked to had a story. There was Kevin, 2 streets over, who had been fined 3 times in 1 month for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, a portable one, not a permanent installation, even though the CC and RS only restricted permanent installations. There was Melinda, a single mother working 2 jobs, who had received a $400 fine for not replacing a section of her fence quickly enough after a windstorm. Even though she had submitted an insurance claim and was waiting for funds, and had notified the HOA in writing that the repair was in progress. There was an elderly couple, the Pattersons, in their mid-70s, who had received a collection notice. Not just a fine, an actual debt collection notice, for allegedly unpaid dues from 3 years ago that they insisted they had paid. They were terrified. They had paid those dues. They had the checks. But they were elderly and intimidated, and they had already paid the amount again just to make it stop. Marcus sat with the Pattersons in their living room one evening. Mr. Patterson, who had worked as a machinist for 40 years, sat across from Marcus with his hands folded in his lap, looking embarrassed. "I know we paid," he said quietly, "but we didn't know what to do. We were scared they'd put a lien on the house." Alia. That word sat in Marcus's chest like a stone. Because here's the thing. HOAs actually can place liens on your property for unpaid dues and fines. In some states, they can even foreclose on your home. For fines. For miscolored mailbox post. That night, Marcus drove home slowly. He was quiet at dinner. His wife, Dana, who taught 3rd grade and had the patience of a saint but also the instincts of a prosecutor, looked at him across the table and said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking this is bigger than a mailbox." Marcus organized a neighborhood meeting. He kept it low-key. He sent handwritten notes to 12 neighbors he'd already spoken with, inviting them to his house on a Thursday evening. He made coffee and Dana made cookies because, as she said, people think more clearly when they're comfortable. 11 people showed up. 11 people sat in Marcus's living room, and living room overflow into the kitchen. And for the first time, they all talked openly about what had been happening to them. The stories were remarkable. Over the past 3 years alone, Marcus tallied up the fines that just those 11 people had collectively paid. The total was over $14,000. Some of those fines were legitimate, real violations of real rules. But a significant portion of them appear to be either improperly issued, improperly noticed, or for violations that didn't hold up against the actual language of the CC and RS. One woman, Angela, a nurse who lived on Willow Creek Drive, said something that silenced the room. She said, "Do you know that Diane's house has never once been fined? In 7 years. Not once. I've looked. I requested the fine records through a public records request to the management company. Diane's address appears nowhere." The room got very quiet. Then Kevin said, "Her cousin does the landscaping for the common areas." "I looked that up too." Another silence. Priya, the HOA board member who had joined with good intentions and had been quietly miserable ever since, had not been invited to the meeting because no one was sure whose side she was on. But Marcus had been thinking about her. He thought about her differently now. The meeting ended with a consensus. They needed to act. But they needed to act smart. They needed documentation. They needed to formally request records. They needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before they made any moves. Marcus said, "We do this right. We document everything. Every fine, every notice, every violation. We get a paper trail that could survive a courtroom, because if I'm right about what's happening here, that's exactly where this might end up." Angela said, "What do you think is happening here?" Marcus took a breath. "I think someone has been running a very quiet, very effective money scheme for a long time, and nobody noticed because everybody was too scared or too busy or too isolated to compare notes." Ohio state law, specifically the Ohio Planned Community Act and relevant nonprofit corporation statutes, gives homeowners and HOA communities the right to inspect and request copies of the association's financial records, meeting minutes, and governing documents. Marcus had looked this up. He had printed the relevant statutes. He had highlighted the key provisions. He submitted a formal written records request to Summit Ridge Management, the management company that handled Meadowbrook's day-to-day operations. He requested meeting minutes from the past 3 years, all financial statements and bank record for the same period, a complete list of all fines issued in that period with the associated property addresses, all contracts with vendors including landscaping, pool maintenance, and any other service providers, and documentation of the reserve fund balance and any expenditures from it. He sent this letter by certified mail. He kept a copy. He photographed the postal receipt. He noted the date and time. Summit Ridge Management had 10 days to respond under Ohio law. On day 8, he received a reply. It was a letter on Summit Ridge letterhead, signed by someone with the title Community Relations Coordinator, which informed him that the requested records were proprietary in nature and that disclosure would require board approval. They invited him to submit his request to the HOA board directly. Marcus read the letter, nodded slowly, and made a note. Summit Ridge is covering for the board, or doesn't understand the law. Either way, he forwarded the letter to a friend of his from college, a man named Jerome who had become a real estate attorney in Columbus. He included a brief note. Jerome, I think I need your help. Jerome called him within the hour. Marcus, he said, what you just described. That response from a management company is not how this works. They can't deny a records request like that. You got a right to those records. If they refuse, they're in violation of state law. I know, said Marcus. I just wanted to hear you say it. Jerome laughed. What are you building? Marcus said, a case. Word got around. It always does in small communities, and Meadowbrook Estates was small enough that Diane Kowalski knew about Marcus's neighborhood meeting within about 5 days of it happening. Marcus suspected Gerald had something to do with that, though he could never prove it. What he didn't expect was how fast Diane would move. Within 2 weeks of his records request, Marcus received 4 separate fine notices. 4 in one envelope. The first was for a crack in his driveway that allegedly violated exterior maintenance standards. The crack was barely visible. He had to get on his hands and knees to see it clearly. The second was for a dead flower in one of his front planting beds. 1 flower. The third was for having his trash cans visible from the street at approximately 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday. His trash pickup was on Saturdays, and he had brought them in by 5 p.m. The fourth, and this one was truly extraordinary, was for the color of his front door. His front door was painted what he had always called slate blue. It had been that color when he bought the house. He had the closing documents showing the home in that color. The previous owner had painted it slate blue, but the notice informed him that slate blue was not on the approved exterior color palette and that he must repaint the door within 30 days in an approved color. The approved color closest to his current door color? Dusty pewter, which was also, to any human eye, slate blue. The combined fines totaled $675. Dana sat at the kitchen table staring at the notices. She said, "They know what you're doing and they're trying to bury you." Marcus nodded. "Good," he sighed. Dana looked at him. "Good. Every one of these is a violation of the cure period requirement. Every single one. They didn't give me a written warning before any of them. They went straight to fines. Again, they keep doing the same illegal thing over and over." He picked up his phone and called Jerome. "Jerome, I need you to send them a letter." Jerome's letter was 4 pages long. It cited Ohio revised code chapter by chapter. It enumerated each and every fine Marcus had received, noted the specific procedural violation associated with each one, no prior written warning, number 30-day cure period, and formally notified the HOA that all of these fines were improperly issued, legally unenforceable, and that Marcus would not be paying them. It also formally renewed the records request, citing the specific state statutes that required disclosure, and gave Summit Ridge Management and the HOA board 10 days to comply before legal action would be initiated. And here's the part that Marcus particularly loved. It included a note at the bottom requesting, pursuant to the HOA's own bylaws, a special meeting of the homeowners to address concerns about financial transparency and board conduct. Under the bylaws, if 20% of homeowners signed a petition requesting a special meeting, the board was required to hold one within 60 days. Marcus had 11 people from his living room. He needed about 68 signatures, 20% of 340 homes. He had more than that within a week. The response from people was almost overwhelming. Once word got around that someone was actually pushing back, actually citing laws, actually having an attorney send letters, people came out of the woodwork. Marcus spent that week going door to door in the evenings after school, and he heard story after story. He collected signatures. He collected stories. He collected phone numbers. He collected evidence. By day 7, he had 94 signatures. By day 10, he had 117. He submitted the petition to Summit Ridge Management, along with a cover letter from Jerome. He sent it by certified mail. He emailed copies to every email address associated with the HOA that he could find. He kept records of everything. Now, remember Priya. The board member who had joined with good intentions and had spent the past year quietly dying inside. Marcus had been thinking about her for weeks. He finally reached out. Not through the board, not through official channels. He knocked on her door on a Sunday afternoon with a jar of Dana's homemade jam. Not as a bribe, he would later explain, but because his mother had always told him never to go to someone's house empty-handed. Priya answered the door, took one look at him, and said, "I've been waiting for someone to knock on this door for 6 months." She invited him in. They sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. What Priya told Marcus, off the record and later on the record with Jerome present, was that the HOA's financial practices had concerned her from the moment she joined the board. The financial statements presented at board meetings were summary documents, just numbers on a page, no supporting receipts, no itemized contracts. When she had asked for more detail, she'd been told by Diane that the management company handles the specifics. She had asked for a copy of the landscaping contract, the one awarded to Diane's cousin's company. She was told it was being renewed and the paperwork wasn't ready. She asked again 6 months later. Same answer. She also told him something that made Marcus's stomach drop. The reserve fund, the savings account that was supposed to be set aside for major future repairs like roof replacements on the community center, repaving the parking areas, pool equipment, was supposed to contain, according to a reserve study done in 2016, approximately $240,000 by 2019. She had asked Summit Ridge for the current balance at the last board meeting. She was told it was $47,000. Nearly $200,000 had either been spent or was missing, and no one had provided documentation. Marcus sat very still for a moment. Then he said to Priya, "Would you be willing to say all of this formally, in writing?" Priya looked at the jam jar on the table. Then she looked at Marcus. "I moved here to be part of a community," she said. "Not this." "I know," said Marcus. "Me too." "Yes," she said. "I'll say it in writing." The special meeting was held on a Thursday evening in October 2019 in the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center. The board was legally required to hold it. They had tried, subtly, to make it as inconvenient as possible, scheduling it for a Thursday at 6 p.m., which conflicted with school events, sports practices, and the general exhaustion of midweek life. Marcus's informal team had been quietly spreading the word for 2 weeks. The community center held about 120 people. There were 160 residents there that night. People were standing along the walls. They were standing in the doorway. Don, the retired electrician, had brought a lawn chair and set it up near the side exit. Angela, the nurse, had come straight from a 12-hour shift and was still in her scrubs. The Pattersons sat in the front row, holding hands, looking both nervous and determined. Diane sat behind the fold-out table at the front of the room, flanked by Linda and Tom, and, notably, with Gerald sitting behind her, legal pad at the ready. Rob was at the end of the table, looking like a man who desperately wished he was somewhere else. Priya sat at the table and looked directly at the audience with an expression that could only be described as prepared. Diane opened the meeting with what she clearly intended to be a commanding performance. She called the meeting to order, thanked everyone for attending, noted that the agenda for the evening had been set by the board, and began to speak about what she called certain misinformation circulating in the community. And then Marcus raised his hand. Diane looked at him. "Mr. Webb, you'll have an opportunity to speak during public comment." "I appreciate that," Marcus said calmly. "I just want to note for the record that this meeting was called pursuant to a homeowner petition under Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws, and as such, the agenda must reflect the concerns outlined in that petition. Otherwise, the meeting itself would be a bylaw violation." He said it pleasantly. He said it the way you say something when you've read the relevant section about 60 times. Diane stared at him. Gerald's pen hovered over the legal pad. "The agenda," Marcus continued, "should include discussion of financial transparency, specifically the reserve fund balance and its recent depletion, the vendor contracting process, the failure to provide the documents required under Ohio state law in response to a formal records request, and the pattern of procedurally invalid fines issued to multiple homeowners." He paused. "I have those items documented. Would you like me to distribute copies to the board and to the audience?" He reached down and picked up a cardboard box. Inside were 170 printed packets. Diane said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Gerald's pen was still hovering. What happened next was one of those moments that people would talk about in Meadowbrook Estates for a very long time. Marcus and Jerome, who was sitting in the audience, which Diane had not expected, walked through the documentation systematically. Jerome explained, in plain language, the requirements of Ohio law regarding HOA record-keeping and disclosure. He explained the findings in Marcus's research, the procedural violations in the fine notices, the bylaws violations around term limits, the missed annual meeting notifications, the lapsed state filing. Then Priya spoke. She spoke quietly and clearly, and she laid out her concerns about the financials with the methodical precision of someone who had been storing these observations for months and finally had permission to release them. When she described the reserve fund, the $240,000 that should have been there, the $47,000 that actually was, the room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is shifted and everyone present knows it. Diane said, "The reserve fund balance reflects planned expenditures." "What expenditures?" Someone from the audience called out. "What was the money spent on?" "Summit Ridge manages the financials." "Then where are the financial statements?" Angela called from the side of the room. "We've requested them 3 times. Diane looked at Tom. Tom looked at Linda. Linda looked at the table. Rob, at the end of the board table, quietly pushed his copy of the printed packet to the center of the table, folded his hands on top of it, and said, in the most quietly devastating tone, "Diane, I think we need to answer these questions." Diane turned to look at him as if he just said something in a foreign language. And then something truly unexpected happened. Gerald, the devoted assistant, the man who had typed HOA minutes in Times New Roman 11 point for years, put down his pen, stood up from his chair behind the board table, and walked around and sat down in the audience section. He sat down next to Don, who was still in his lawn chair. Don looked at him. Gerald shrugged. Don nodded slowly. The room erupted. The meeting ended without resolution that night. These things rarely do, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Diane called the meeting adjourned amid a chorus of objections, and she left through the side door with the expression of someone who knows the ground has moved beneath them. But the work was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Jerome filed formal complaints with the Ohio Attorney General's office, the state's nonprofit division, and the relevant county housing authority. He also sent a formal demand letter for all outstanding financial records, backed by the threat of a lawsuit. The records, when they finally came, under legal pressure, were illuminating. The landscaping contract for Meadowbrook's common areas had been awarded every year for 6 years to a company called Greenline Outdoor Services. The owner of Greenline Outdoor Services was one Daniel Kowalski, Diane's cousin. The annual contract was $68,000 per year. For context, 3 competing bids that Jerome's office solicited, for comparison purposes, came in between $31,000 and $39,000. Greenline was billing the community roughly double the market rate, year after year, for 6 years. That was a nearly $200,000 overpayment over 6 years. The same amount the reserve fund was short. There was also the matter of a special assessment that had been levied against homeowners in 2017, $300 per household, for what the HOA had described as emergency pool equipment replacement. Jerome's review found that the pool equipment had been replaced. Yes, it had been replaced at a cost of $28,000. The special assessment had collected approximately $100,000 from 340 households at $300 each. The remaining $72,000 had moved from the HOA account to a Summit Ridge Management Facilitation Fee account with no further documentation of where it had gone from there. It was, to put plainly, not complicated. It was the oldest, simplest financial scheme. Inflate the contracts, collect the fees, skim the surplus, and count on the fact that nobody is watching. What made it work was the fine structure, the constant fines, the intimidation, the making of every homeowner feel like they were one violation away from trouble. So they kept their heads down and focused on their mailbox post color and didn't look at the bigger picture. By March of 2020, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board had been completely restructured. Diane Kowalski resigned her presidency in November 2019, citing personal reasons. Tom and Linda followed within a month. Rob had already effectively checked out. A new board was elected, including Marcus, who had initially been reluctant but was convinced by Dana, by Angela, by Dawn, and ultimately by Emma, who said, with the devastating clarity of a 9-year-old, "Daddy, you have to make sure nobody else's strawberries get fined." Jerome filed a civil lawsuit against Diane Kowalski and 2 officers of Summit Ridge Management for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent misappropriation of community funds. The lawsuit was settled confidentially in late 2020. Under the terms of the settlement, which Marcus could not disclose in detail, a substantial payment was made back to the HOA Community Fund, enough to fully replenish the reserve fund, and then some. Every improperly issued fine was voided. Every homeowner who had paid an invalid fine was given a credit toward future dues. The Pattersons, who had been double charged for dues they had already paid, received a full refund and a written apology, which Marcus knew was small compared to the anxiety they'd suffered, but it was something. Greenline Outdoor Services' contract was terminated. A new landscaping contract was awarded through a transparent competitive bid process to a local firm that charged $34,000 per year. That's $34,000 annually versus $68,000 annually for a neighborhood of 340 families. The management company Summit Ridge was fired and replaced with a new firm that operated under a transparent digital platform where every homeowner could log in and see the association's financial records in real time. And Marcus's garden bed, Emma's strawberry garden, received a retroactive architectural committee approval. They put in writing, signed, notarized. Marcus had it framed and hung it on the wall next to the raised bed. Now here's what I need you to hear, because this story isn't just about Meadowbrook Estates and one schoolteacher with a highlighted CC and RS document. This story is everywhere. The Community Associations Institute estimates that approximately 75 million Americans, roughly 1 in 4, live in some kind of community governed by an HOA. That's 75 million people paying dues, receiving fines, and largely trusting that someone responsible is managing the money. Studies suggest that financial mismanagement, whether through incompetence or outright fraud, affects a significant portion of HOA communities nationwide. Reserve funds are chronically underfunded across the country. Research from the Foundation for Community Association Research suggests that a substantial majority of HOAs have reserve funds that are less than 70% funded, which means when roofs need replacing and parking lots need repaving, those costs often fall directly on homeowners through emergency special assessments. And the fine system, the thing that made Marcus a target, is a well-documented pressure tool used in many communities, where fines become a revenue generator rather than a compliance tool, falling disproportionately on newer residents, residents of color, single-parent households, and anyone who asks too many questions. The reason this happens so often is simple. Most people don't read the governing documents. Most people don't know their rights. Most people don't have a Jerome, a lawyer friend who can translate legalese into action. Most people are just trying to live their lives. And the people who want to exploit that, they count on it. So what does Marcus Webb's story teach the rest of us? It teaches us that documentation is power. Every notice, every fine, every letter, save it. Date it. Know when it arrived. Keep it in a folder. This is your evidence. It teaches us that governing documents are your friend if you read them. The CC and RS, the bylaws, the rules and regulations. These are the rules that the HOA itself is bound by. Read them. Know them. Because the people enforcing them are counting on the fact that you don't. It teaches us that state laws protect you. Every state has laws governing HOAs and community associations. Ohio has the Ohio Planned Community Act. Florida has the Florida Homeowners Association Act. Texas, California, and every other state have equivalent statutes. These laws define your rights to records, your right to fair notice before fines, your right to vote, and to petition for meetings. These are not theoretical rights. They're legal rights. It teaches us to follow the money. Find out who your HOA contracts with. Find out if any board members have relationships with those vendors. Request the financials. Compare contract prices to market rates. Ask about the reserve fund. Ask specifically, what is the current reserve fund balance, and how does it compare to the recommended level in the most recent reserve study? And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that you are not alone. The isolation that made every person in Meadowbrook feel like they were the only one having trouble, that was the point. That was the design. The moment those 11 people sat in Marcus's living room and compared notes, the dynamic changed completely. Because here's the truth. The people who run bad HOAs are not powerful. They're not sophisticated. They're just organized and counting on your disorganization. They are betting that you won't talk to your neighbors. They are betting that you won't read the documents. They are betting that the fine notices will feel scary enough to make you comply without ever questioning whether they're valid. And they are right until they aren't. Marcus Webb still lives at 14 Coventry Court. He still coaches basketball. He still waves at his neighbors from the driveway. He still shovels people out before they wake up after a snowstorm. He is now in his second year as HOA board president, a role he took on with the same energy he brings to teaching. The conviction that most people, given good information and a fair process, will do the right thing. Emma's strawberry garden, by the way, produced an absolutely spectacular crop last summer. She made jam. She gave some to the Pattersons. She gave some to Dawn. She gave a jar to Priya, who laughed when she received it and said it was the best thing she'd gotten from that neighborhood in years. And Gerald, the man who typed the minutes and times, knew Roman 11 point and then, at the crucial moment, stood up and walked to the other side of the room. Gerald now volunteers at the community center on Tuesday mornings, helping elderly residents navigate documents and official correspondence. He and Don have become, against all odds, genuinely close friends. Diane Kowalski moved out of Meadowbrook Estates in the spring of 2020. She relocated to a different neighborhood, roughly 30 miles away. Marcus heard through the grapevine, sometime in 2021, that she had joined that neighborhood's HOA board. He thought about that for a moment. He genuinely hoped that someone there had read their CC and RS. Because here's the last thing this story teaches us, the thing that Marcus Webb would want you to take away from all of this. Your home is yours. Whatever you sacrifice for it, whatever you worked for, whatever dreams you poured into those walls and that yard and that little raised garden bed with your daughter's name on the side, those are yours. Nobody gets to take them from you quietly. Nobody gets to bury you in fine notices and intimidate you into looking the other way while they help themselves to your community's money. Knowledge is the mailbox post paint color they never told you about. It's the Appendix D they hoped you'd never find. It's the reserve fund balance they hoped you'd never ask about. Read the documents. Know your rights. Talk to your neighbors. Follow the money. And if someone tells you that the CC and RS are very clear on this, smile, pull out your highlighted copy, and say, actually, I've read them. And you might want to take another look at page 34. If you found this video valuable, and I think you did because you're still here, please share it. Share it with anyone you know who lives in an HOA. Share it with anyone who's ever gotten a fine notice that didn't feel right. Share it with anyone who's ever felt powerless in their own home. Because the thing that made Marcus Webb extraordinary wasn't that he was lucky, or that he had the right connections, or that he was some kind of legal genius. It was that he paid attention. It was that he didn't stop asking questions. It was that he refused to believe that a yellow envelope on his doorstep was the final word. And neither should you. Stay curious. Stay informed. And don't ever let anyone fine you for the wrong shade of brown. We'll see you in the next one.